Amongst the ashes of the Syrian Civil War emerged one of the most barbaric, violent groups to have ever existed. A group so violent that even Al-Qaeda considered them their enemy, rising from a small armed band to one of the Middle East's most feared fighting forces. The abuses committed by ISIS were some of the most savage since the death camps of World War II. Slavery, crucifixion, beheadings, and genocide are just some of their crimes. For almost 10 years, thousands of innocents lived under their harsh and bloody regime. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, better known as ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh, would come to prominence in 2013, emerging as a central player in the Syrian Civil War. They were on no one's side and fought against the government forces of Assad, the Kurdish YPG, the Free Syrian Army, Hezbollah, and anyone else who opposed their ideology. The group was formed in 1999, but as with many other small Al-Qaeda-affiliated militia, remained in relative obscurity. Many of their fighters and top commanders would be captured or killed during the war in Iraq by a combination of American forces and the Sons of Iraq militia. By 2008, the group had almost been wiped out, with even its own members declaring it to be in an extraordinary crisis. In 2010, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi would become the group's new leader. His leadership would revitalize the group, allowing it to become one of the world's most feared terrorist organizations. As the civil war in Syria began, thousands of ISIS fighters would be sent across the border from Iraq, with the end goal of establishing a strict Islamic caliphate governed by Sharia law, with al-Baghdadi as its head. At its peak in 2014, ISIS controlled over 100,000 square kilometers of land. The group ruled over 30% of Syria and 40% of Iraq, with small pockets of territory elsewhere in the Middle East and Africa. Upon entry into the Syrian Civil War, their manpower grew quickly. They achieved this by conquering other Islamic forces and assimilating them into their ranks. In one estimation, ISIS had 80,000 soldiers by August 2014. They managed to win victory after victory against their enemies, often due to their violent reputation. Many of their opponents, whether Iraqi militias, Syrian government forces, or anti-Assad rebels, would rather flee than fight, as they were well aware that, if defeated, their deaths would be slow and painful. Many uniformed soldiers, when facing an oncoming ISIS attack, would strip down to civilian clothes and flee. After sweeping through Syria and Iraq, the Islamic Caliphate of ISIS was proclaimed. They controlled an area roughly the size of Iceland or Tennessee, with its capital city being Raqqa in Syria. The Caliphate would fall in 2017, when Raqqa and Mosul fell to pro-democratic Iraqi and Syrian forces. But this would not be the end of ISIS and its hold on the area. Ideology. The Islamic State followed an extreme form of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism. Wahhabism called for the cleansing of Islam and the purging of groups who supposedly defile the religion with false teachings and incorrect morals. It was an apocalyptic sect, expecting the end times to arrive after ISIS had defeated the enemies of Islam and re-established the early Islamic Rashidun Caliphate, which was formed immediately after the death of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. The ideology glorified murder, believed that spilling the blood of apostates and heretics was the best way to attain paradise in the next life. Anyone who did not ascribe to this strict ideology was seen as an enemy, as vermin that required extermination. It persecuted non-Muslims heavily, but had a particular ire for Shia Muslims, who were viewed as perverting and desecrating the true Islamic religion. The law of the Caliphate was Sharia law. Slavery of certain classes was legal, while women were stripped of their rights and seen as property of their husbands. They could not walk the streets alone. Domestic abuse was legal, and they were unable to seek divorce. Criminal acts, such as stealing, were punished harshly, with those convicted of thievery having a hand amputated. All manner of cruel punishments were used, from crucifixion, beheadings, or even being burnt at the stake. Acts of supposed female morality were policed by the all-women Al-Qanza Brigade. They patrolled the streets, enforcing dress codes and the actions of women in public. Women could be arrested for many offenses, such as walking the streets without a male chaperone, wearing making or form-fitting robes, or not acting meek enough when confronted with authority. The ideology was so extreme and committed so many heinous acts that even other Islamic terrorist groups spoke out against it. Even the Emir of Al-Qaeda, a group responsible for killing countless innocent people, said of the Islamic State's actions that such acts affect the protected blood of women, children, and non-combatant Shia public, who are protected because they are excused for their ignorance. Slavery and genocide. Both Syria and Iraq are home to many ethnic and religious minorities. The Yazidi, Mandaeans, Assyrians, Turkmen, Druze, and many more were all victims of ISIS. For some groups, the reasons were religious, and others political. In accordance with their extremely strict interpretations of Sharia law, ISIS believed in and practiced the genocide of their men and the enslavement of their women. Thousands of women were forced into sexual slavery, purchased and sold at auction like livestock. Under the laws of the Caliphate, these women had no rights, and much like the chattel slavery of the 18th and 19th centuries, were viewed merely as property. The trade in slaves was viewed as an important source of income for the so-called Islamic Caliphate and was regulated by the governing authorities. In 2014, a document regulating the prices of these slaves was released and verified as being a genuine Islamic State document. It outlined the prices for Yazidi and Christian women of differing ages. Those aged between 40 and 50 were the least expensive, at $43, while the most costly were girls under 9 years of age, who were sold for $172. The Yazidi people of Syria were one principal target of ISIS, who wished to eradicate their men and enslave their women. The Yazidi people follow a pre-Islamic religion, which is considered by ISIS to be a form of devil worship, making them guilty of heresy and stripping them of any protection under the law. Yazidi villages in the Sinjar region were attacked, with many massacres taking place. Many villages had their entire male population wiped out. Many were shot, though others suffered incredibly, with reports and even video footage of people being burned to death, buried alive, or beheaded. On August 3, 2014, ISIS launched a large-scale attack on the Sinjar province, where many Yazidis lived. In each town or village, tens or hundreds were brutally murdered, with much of the bloodshed being filmed and used for propaganda. Many of these areas were inhabited by both Yazidis and Sunni Muslims. Despite having lived together in relative peace, many of the Sunnis collaborated with the invading ISIS forces, letting them know where to find the Yazidi families or tricking the Yazidi people into remaining in the area. Over 200,000 people fled, with 50,000 taking refuge among the Sinjar Mountains. Those who remained were forced to convert to Sunni Islam or face death. The Yazidi were not people of the book, and so, unlike some Christians, they were not given the option of paying the jizya, a tax paid by some groups to continue living unharmed within the Caliphate. The Yazidis, atop Mount Sinjar, were cut off from the outside world. They had no access to food, water, or medicine, and day by day the ISIS militants were advancing closer, as artillery bombarded the mountains. Kurdish forces, aided by British and American airstrikes, as well as food and medicine airdropped onto the mountain, would eventually break the siege, but not until after thousands had been killed, tortured, and enslaved. The Turkmen of Iraq were also seen as enemies of the Caliphate. Despite being majority Sunni Muslim, they were viewed as a potential fifth column and as natural enemies of the Caliphate due to their ethnic ties with Turkey, an enemy of the Islamic State. The first actions against the Turkmen would come in June of 2014, after the capture of the city of Tal Afar, a city comprised almost entirely of Turkmen. 300 were massacred, while 1,300 were abducted, with the Iraqi Turkmen Front, a political movement supporting the rights of Turkmen in Iraq, reporting that only 42 ever returned. By September, over 350,000 had been forced to flee, as they suffered violence and starvation. In February of the following year, this figure almost doubled to 600,000. Around 600 Turkmen women were also sold into sexual slavery, often being transported from Iraq to female slave prisons in Syria. These women were either forcefully married to ISIS fighters or used as slaves by multiple militants. Many Turkmen left their ancestral homes during the conflict, and most are yet to return. Many of these minority groups formed local militias to protect their homes and families. They were vastly outnumbered, had little access to heavy weapons, and had little funding with which to purchase ammunition and rifles. Groups such as Sinjar resistance units, Nevea Plains forces, and Turkmen brigades fought valiantly, but were ineffective on their own. Most of their successes came when working alongside the Kurdish Peshmerga. If ISIS had not eventually been defeated, these minorities would have been exterminated or enslaved. Funding the Caliphate. Though unrecognized by all foreign governments, the Islamic State was functionally a small country. It had to organize the production of electricity, the distribution of water, construction works, arms manufacturing, and healthcare, and pay its soldiers and government workers. To meet these needs, it required a stable source of income. Much of its funding came from the sale of crude oil and illicit drugs, as well as donations from its foreign supporters, and money made through taxation. Much like any country, the Islamic State levied taxes on its subjects. Those employed in non-combat roles were forced to pay zakat, a tax based on assets owned. Merchants and traders paid ushur, a tariff on the import and export of goods. Fighters were also taxed on their ganima, their spoils of war. This tax, called khums, required them to give 20% of all their captured goods as tax, exposing their true roots as a criminal enterprise. They also practiced extortion, threatening to destroy people's businesses or property if they did not pay a protection fee. Burglaries of banks or jewelry shops were also common. Oil was one of the state's primary sources of income. It was sold domestically with the areas controlled by ISIS and sold on the black market to foreign nations. ISIS sold mainly to local independent traders who purchased the unrefined crude oil directly from the pump. It would then be sold to refineries operated by private businesses who, dependent on the refining technology available to them, produced either petrol or mazout, a low-quality fuel oil that produces much more pollution than petrol or diesel. The most advanced refineries were anything but. There were simple furnaces made from steel tanks, heated by a bonfire lit underneath. The method was much like alcohol distillation. The oil would be heated and vaporized, with the vapor traveling through the pipes in the roof of the furnace. It would then cool down in the pipe and drip out the end into a large trench lined with plastic. The dirty, cancerous debris left over would solidify at the bottom of the tanks, needing constant removal. This job usually fell to young teenage boys, whose small frames could fit inside the tanks. Every part of this process was potentially deadly. The vessels were always at risk of exploding, but just as dangerous are the pollution and chemicals given off by the refining process. Anything within the area would be coated with oily soot. All too common oil spills destroyed the environment, and workers spent the entire day inhaling deadly fumes. One refinery worker said of the job, "We're committing a slow suicide to provide for our children for a few years, until God shows us a way out." These industrial oil fields were a constant target of British, American, and Syrian government airstrikes. Much of the oil money came from international dealings with buyers in Turkey, Iran, Jordan, and Iraq. This trade was illegal, and when oil was sold for refinement, its origin had to be disguised. Oil was sold well below the standard price, making it a lucrative business for those willing to buy it. This oil was transported over the border in various ways. One way was to sell it to legitimate oil traders, who would mix it with legal oil from elsewhere, hiding its origin. Sometimes it was driven across the border to Turkey, where it would either be refined or loaded onto an oil tanker, hidden amongst legitimate oil. One oil smuggler, a former intelligence officer under Saddam Hussein, said that 28 tons of ISIS oil could be purchased for $4,200, which would then be transported to Jordan and sold for $15,000. The United States also accused the Syrian Assad regime of purchasing oil from ISIS, despite the two being mortal enemies. At the peak of the Islamic State's power, it is believed that the production and sale of oil brought in $1 million per day, though some estimate that figure to be as high as $3 million a day. As the beating heart of ISIS, oil refineries were under constant attack from airstrikes. By the end of 2015, the capacity for oil production had reduced dramatically, with income falling from $1 million or more a day to around 660,000. As the former territories of the Islamic State were liberated, funds dried up. ISIS lost thousands of oil wells, lost control of profitable fertilizer and cement plants, and also lost thousands of former taxpayers. In desperation, the group turned to the illicit trade in drugs. Phenethylline, commonly known as Captagon, was a popular drug in the Gulf states and elsewhere in the Arab world. This stimulant drug was also used by many jihadist fighters, as it allowed them to fight for longer, go without food, and numb any fear or nervousness. Despite Islamic laws prohibiting the use of intoxicating drugs, ISIS produced and sold the drug, as well as allowing its soldiers to consume it. ISIS-affiliated groups elsewhere in North Africa and the Middle East who paid taxation to the caliphate also worked trafficking cannabis and hashish, or providing armed security to narcotics gangs. ISIS was on par with the most powerful cartels when it came to drug production and trafficking. In 2020, Italian authorities captured 14 tons of Captagon produced in Syria, 84 million tablets in total, worth $1 billion, the world's largest ever seizure of amphetamines. In 2018, fighters of the Free Syrian Army discovered another cache of drugs worth $1.4 million. Some organizations believe the illegal trade in antiques and artifacts to be their second largest source of income. At one point, ISIS controlled 30% of Iraq's significant historic sites, as well as many in Syria. Many artifacts were destroyed as they were either pre-Islamic or considered un-Islamic, and an offense to God. Those that were not destroyed were often sold on the illegal antiques market. Khaled al-Assad, a Syrian archaeologist, was tortured and murdered for trying to protect these artifacts from ISIS. As their forces closed in on the city of Tadmur, he evacuated the most prized artifacts in an attempt to keep them from being sold or destroyed. He was held in prison for 1 week and brutally punished, but never revealed the location of the artifacts. He was then murdered, and his corpse displayed in the ancient quarters of the city, with a placard labeling him an apostate. The end of the Caliphate. After years of heavy fighting and unimaginable bloodshed, the self-declared Caliphate would fall. By December 2017, Iraqi forces had successfully retaken all the territory once held by ISIS. In early 2019, all that remained of the once feared Caliphate was the small village of al-Baghouz in Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces launched their attack on the 9th of February, liberating the last tiny vestiges of the Islamic State. While the Caliphate is no more, ISIS still exists. Many ISIS-affiliated groups are still active, and many other terrorist groups have pledged allegiance to them. Groups in Africa control territories in Mali, Nigeria, and Somalia, while other groups hold no territories but still carry out violent attacks on innocent civilians. There are also many individuals radicalized online who, despite never having had contact with ISIS, dedicate their attacks to them. Perhaps the most powerful terrorist group the world has ever seen. Its reach spanned the entire globe, with attacks being carried out in 29 countries, spanning from Britain to Syria, India, Australia, the Philippines, Russia, and elsewhere. The Moscow theater attack of the 22nd of March 2024, where 4 ISIS gunmen killed 144 and injured 551 more, shows they still have the strength necessary to carry out their bloodthirsty agenda.